Welcome back to Smarty Van. Today we're in the National Forest in Washington at the foot of Mount St. Helen. I'm Mike and I live with my partner Shar in our 2022 4x4 Sprinter that we built from the ground up as a home automated DIY home on wheels. In the first video, we showed what was possible in our van, and today we're going to talk about the open source home automation platform that makes all that possible, and that is Home Assistant. Let's get to work. Okay, let's talk Home Assistant. There's three things I want to talk about today. 1, what is it? 2, why did we choose it? And 3, how can you get Home Assistant up and running yourself? Okay, so what is Home Assistant? It's not that different from any of the other home automation platforms you might use by Apple, Google, or Amazon, with one major difference. It's open source, which literally means the source code is open for people to copy, branch, and develop as they see fit, and that results in a huge community of people contributing to the software. Home Assistant itself is now part of the Open Home Foundation, which is a nonprofit with a mind for privacy and keeping home automation open. Open Home Foundation also has the ESPHome project, and that'll become clear later as we talk about ESPHome and Home Assistant and how those two things work together. There's one more piece to this puzzle, and that is Nabu Casa. Currently, Nabu Casa has a subscription which allows you to access your Home Assistant install remotely with an encrypted secure connection. Nabu Casa is a sponsor of Home Assistant. So why did we choose Home Assistant? I was really comfortable with Apple's HomeKit, and we tried that. I also looked at Google Home and Alexa, but none of that was really going to work. In a van, we have some really interesting things we want to control, like a Max Air fan or an Arctic Turn hatch and a Victron energy system. And while some of that can be incorporated into these other systems, I really needed all of it to work. I also needed this to work on a low-power DC system, and I wanted everything to work without an internet connection. So we arrived at Home Assistant. It's open source, and I knew there was a huge community around it, which gave me the confidence that we'd be able to incorporate everything in the van. I looked into some of the other open source projects, and they didn't seem robust enough. So Home Assistant it was. So now let's talk about how you can get your own Home Assistant server up and running. Okay, quick side note. While Home Assistant is clearly designed like the other big platforms for homes that don't move, it's powerful enough and flexible enough to let us deal with things like when we are and where we are as we move around. Also, this channel is definitely focused on Home Assistant in a van, but it surely could apply to anyone in any home, even if it doesn't have wheels. Okay, back to it. To get started with Home Assistant, you're going to need a piece of hardware to run it on. Ultimately, it's a server, but it's also an operating system. At the very easiest level, Home Assistant sells something called Home Assistant Green. It's hardware and software already set up. You just plug it in and turn it on. I went with a slightly more complicated but still super easy method of installing Home Assistant operating system on a Raspberry Pi 4 with 8 gigs of RAM. There are other methods of installing Home Assistant, like in a Docker container or manually installing the supervisor or something where you need to run your own OS. But that requires a lot more maintenance and doesn't necessarily support all the features. So I 100% recommend installing Home Assistant OS on your own piece of hardware like a Raspberry Pi. The next thing you need to think about is storage for your server. While you can connect an SSD drive to something like a Raspberry Pi, I've had a ton of luck with micro SD cards. The one I went with is the SanDisk Max Endurance 128GB card. By default, Home Assistant writes every sensor update to a database, and we're definitely going to talk about how to minimize that, but it's important to have a card that can last for a lot of write operations. Okay, now that we know that this tiny device is responsible for the entire home automation platform in the van, if you want to follow along, grab yourself a Raspberry Pi, an SD card, and follow the great guides at homeassistant.io and get yourself up and running. I'll leave links to all this hardware and the guides in the description below. Once you're set up, come back for the next video where we'll power this guy up and look around the Home Assistant interface. We'll talk about some of the basic concepts and lingo of Home Assistant, and we'll even set up our first device. So, until next time, safe travels.